A lot of stuff happening down in Austin, Texas during the legislative session with just days to go down in Austin. We bring on the editor of Quorum Report, our good friend Scott Braddock, who does not live stream his haircuts. No one wants to see that.
No, they don't.
Scott,
they
how
really
many
don't.
days? How many days left?
Oh, let's go to the official
Yes.
countdown at quorumreport.com. 11 days, 13 hours, 53 minutes, and 27 seconds.
All right. And you were there for 12 hours yesterday, 14 hours?
I'm not even sure. I know I left the Capitol at about 12:40 this morning.
All right.
I had tweeted out, that's enough for today. See you tomorrow. And, of course, people responded, it is tomorrow.
It is
and
tomorrow.
I thought, well, it might be a different legislative day, which is a whole different deal, and people don't know about that, and I'm way down in the weeds already, but that's where I live.
All right. Well, let's get into some of the things that are happening down in Austin. First, I want to get into, with 11 days left, it is officially official. There will not be, quote, overwhelming property tax relief.
Wasn't that a remarkable comment from the Speaker of the House? We started out this legislative session talking on KFYO months ago about the fact that the big property tax reform and relief bill, the Act of 2019, was not going to actually offer any property tax relief to anybody, and it took the Republican leadership, about 4 months to catch up to us, right, Chad?
Yeah.
And say, look, there is an argument to be made for, bending the growth in local tax revenues. There are people who have been working on that issue for a long time. But, look, it doesn't cut anybody's taxes. So basically, a couple weeks ago, I'm old enough to remember when they were still talking about a tax swap as the way to do this, raise the sales tax by 16%, which equals out to 1 penny, and do that with the eye toward buying down your property taxes. Well, that all fell apart. Yesterday, Speaker Bonin gave this comment to a local television station. It's been retweeted all over the place. He said there's not going to be overwhelming property tax relief because that whole deal fell apart. And a couple things about that. One, this was never, the sales tax swap was not in their original calculations for how they were going to try to reduce your property taxes. I've come to the conclusion, and I'm not an economist or a tax expert either, but I've been covering this stuff for a long time. So with those, put that out there first as a disclaimer. But if you come in at the end of the process, and I think one of the guys from TPPF, who I don't always agree with, but I think it said something about the level of spending being a problem for how the numbers worked out on this particular deal. He's right from the aspect of if you try to shoehorn this at the end.
Yeah.
Of the process, when you have already made big decisions, right? The House and Senate had already said they were going to spend the entire surplus, the $9 billion surplus on public education. If instead they had said we're going to spend a good amount of that on public education, but also use, who knows, 3, 4, 5 billion of that surplus to buy down property taxes, and then also maybe put that sales tax swap on top of that, well, then you might have seen what some folks would probably describe as more meaningful tax relief, on the property tax bill. I think you had asked the listeners in the last few days or last week, what does meaningful mean to you? And I think they're looking for more like what, Chad, $500 or $1,000 worth of savings, maybe.
Yeah, absolutely.
And maybe you could get there. And when the Legislative Budget Board put out their analysis on the same day that the Big Three had their big press conference, which, by the way, a lot of us in Austin are now convinced that that press conference was really about getting ahead of those numbers that were about to come out, and not just come out from some random analyst, which, by the way, at quorumreport.com, our economist, Dr. Stuart Greenfield, he did an analysis that I think you and I talked about in the weeks before that basically said the same thing, that unless you were making over $150,000 a year, this was not going to benefit you. But if the sales tax deal had been part of the original equation and it was factored into budget decisions early on in the legislative session, and if the governor had been trying to sell people on this in the months leading up to the legislative session, it would look very different. Instead of being somebody who has to make $150 or more to have this benefit you. And by the way, the numbers from Senate Property Tax Chairman Paul Betancourt seem to indicate that unless you were in a home that was valued at about $650,000 or better, both of those things had to be true. You needed to be making $150 and be in a home that is worth that much for this sales tax swap to work for you, given the numbers they were stuck with, in the last couple of weeks. But you could have gotten those numbers to look a whole lot better if this was part of the original equation. You probably could have had a sales tax swap that would have benefited people who were making more like $55,000, $60,000, something like that, and that would be a lot more attractive to people. But that just falls apart, and now the speaker's basically, I think, in a lot of ways, playing into what Texas Democrats have said their message is going to be heading into the 2020 elections, which is, number one, the Republican leadership didn't do what they said they were going to do, which is offer meaningful property tax relief. And the other thing is that the Democrats are going to argue that this leadership team is still married to the sales tax swap, which I think you pointed out early on, I know on the show and on Twitter. Look, these guys, in the way they did this, in saying, we'll get back to this in 2021 in the next legislative session, they've made it an issue. The Republican leadership is, at least for right now, and talk about losing the message war on this. I think Republican candidates in their primaries, if they're challenged from their right, are going to be asked about this sales tax increase and the way it was going to work out. And I think in general elections it's going to be an issue for some of the folks who already were probably going to be in some tough races, particularly Republicans who are trying to hold on to Texas House seats in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, in the Houston area, particularly in the fast-growth areas, in the suburbs there. I don't think they're doing themselves any favors by still talking about this. You would think that it would be something they'd want to put in the rearview mirror. Maybe they will. I mean, obviously, there's plenty of time to go before the next election. But as you know, there's very little daylight, very little time between governing and the campaigns anymore.
Yeah.
I mean, as soon as we get out of here, people are. I mean, there are some candidates who are already declared. I know in Dallas, for example, there's one Democrat who's already running against one of the state representatives up there, and has been running during the legislative session. So it's not like they get a break from the political attacks that are going to go along with this thing.
Well, and Scott, another thing that I thought about it yesterday when I saw this was that with the speaker saying, that the only way, basically, I mean, this is how I kind of framed it and understood it, is that the tax swap idea, that was how we were going to get overwhelming. This is what he said, overwhelming property tax relief. So what that is telling me is the only way to get overwhelming property tax relief moving into the future is this tax swap. That's almost what it sounds like to me he is saying, which, okay, if you look at Texas Public Policy Foundation, you look at Empower Texans, both on the right, both conservative groups.
Sure.
Empower Texans, they were 100% against the tax swap. Yeah. Texas Public Policy Foundation, they were for it if you reduce the spending, and no one's talking about reducing spending. And so it seems like to me the speaker, maybe he didn't mean to do this, I don't know, but he's linked himself to an opinion that we're not going to spend less money in the future. We're just going to try to do this tax swap. That is basically opposed by the Benton courts, the conservatives, the Republicans, and it's opposed by a fair number of Democrats as well. It's
really an interesting calculation. I mean, I think people are going to be attacked from both the right and the left about this if this continues to be the message from the leadership. It's my understanding that the Republican Party of Texas took some incoming fire from grassroots activists about this. As you know, Chad, it's been in the Republican Party of Texas platform for about 2 decades that the state should move toward consumption taxes and away from local property taxes as the way to fund government. But the way that this was done was so ham-handed, as we were saying. It was kind of sort of done in a slapdash way at the 11th hour of a legislative session, really, when you're talking about a tax policy. This did not go over well, and I think if this is what people are running on going into the next election, I think that incumbents are going to have a really tough time, if they were anybody who could have been said to support this thing, and they're going to have to answer the question, and this is the key. Do you support that? Now, I think that in fairness to the speaker, one of the things that he's kind of driving at with that is that you're not going to see local property taxes, quote unquote, overwhelmingly reduced unless there is another revenue stream.
Right.
And this is where we're at. It may be that he doesn't necessarily want to do this tax swap the way it was structured, in this last month, as it's been debated very hotly here in Texas. But they've got to find other sources of revenue. Property taxes are killing, a lot of people who are in homes that they never expected to be paying so much in property taxes. And, I hear Democrats and Republicans alike, acknowledge that, especially those who want to be competitive in those fast growth areas that I mentioned in the suburbs, but in other parts of Texas as well. I think one of the issues here is that this pain of property taxes is felt unevenly. There are some folks who are really suffering, and then others, of course, would like to see their tax bill lower. Nobody would want to pay more, right?
Yeah.
But there is a question about whether homestead exemptions could be increased, as Betancourt was talking about, taking it up to, I think he was talking about 40,000. But what you're really doing when you move toward greater homestead exemptions, at that point you're really asking for business to pick up a bigger piece of the tab. What people sometimes call a split roll, which they sort of have in California, where you have basically one calculation for homeowners and a different calculation for people who are running businesses. And that would mean that some of the larger property owners, the folks who own skyscrapers and folks who own industrial plants along the Gulf Coast, they would be picking up more of the property tax bill, and they already pay a hefty amount. But right now we have this equal and uniform situation in Texas, which it's one of the sort of key aspects of our property tax system, is that basically these properties are all supposed to sort of be treated the same. And some people have started asking, why doesn't business have to pick up more of the tab? Of course, that is in conflict with our long-running theme in Texas of being so business-friendly. So look, paying for public schools and that's the key. This is about paying for public schools. And when they talk about under SB 2, the rollback election legislation, they're talking about putting caps on future growth and revenue with cities, counties, ISDs, et cetera. But it's the actual act of paying for public schools and who is supposed to do that. That's the real challenge, and that's what has always been one of the heaviest lifts at the Texas Capitol, because in income tax, totally off the table, right? I grew up First Baptist Church of El Campo, Texas, and the old folks would joke back then, we will have casinos in Baptist churches before there's an income tax in Texas. So we're not doing that. So what other revenue streams could they look at? And as the Democrats pointed out in this legislative session, I think some Republicans agree with this, that some of the tax exemptions could be looked at to find billions of dollars worth of revenue that could be used to buy down people's property taxes.
Yeah, we got a few minutes left, Scott. Let's talk about we'll talk about ChickFilA on Monday.
Okay. It'll still be good.
Yeah,
it'll still be spicy. It'll still be ready to go.
Absolutely. We'll talk about ChickFilA and the ChickFilA bill on Monday. Let's talk about Senate Bill 9, because this seems to be kind of a brewing, a little bit of a battle down in Austin on this.
Yeah, and I would say that the thing about the ChickFilA bill and this bill that has to do with upping the penalties for what Democrats say is sort of criminalizing mistakes. Republicans say it's about ballot integrity. But this battle is shaping up in a real partisan way. As we talked about the other day, we haven't seen a lot of these sort of nasty partisan fights in this legislative session.
Yeah.
But with the ChickFilA thing and with this bill, it seems like we're on track for that. I'm trying to figure out if it's theater. If the two parties are trying to get on the record with some votes, that they can go back in their primaries and say, I voted to, if I'm a Republican, I voted to, crack down on voter fraud, which of course plays very well with Republican voters, and Democrats, saying that, no, this is, disenfranchising people, and the same kind of arguments you've heard for a long time on these sorts of issues. All of a sudden we have one of those sorts of fights on our hand with Senate Bill 9. There was a hearing all night. I was at the Capitol till about 12:40 this morning, till it wrapped up. They were scheduled to have a vote on this morning, here in the last half hour or so, in the committee to try to move this thing forward. But that vote did not happen. I'm told that one of the Republican members of the committee was not present, and so they didn't have a quorum this morning. So we'll see if it gets voted out of committee later today. But we're up against those legislative deadlines that we've talked about before, Chad, where if these bills don't pass, by certain days on the calendar, and I believe for this to move forward, it would need to clear a couple of hurdles before Tuesday for it to happen. But there is some fighting even within the Republican Party about this, because the original bill, Senate Bill 9, would call for a paper trail, paper ballots.
Yeah.
And you have some Republicans who say that's not the way to do this. In Harris County, which is the largest county in Texas and the largest Republican county party, the county party there is against it, but the Republican Party of Texas is for the paper trail, and so is a lot of the Tea Party groups. And so the whole thing may just break down, and it may end up being a bunch of drama in the meantime. So watch it closely out of Austin. The Senate Bill 9, I think it has the sort of juice to become a nationally noticed fight about quote-unquote voting rights in Texas.
Before I let you go, it seems, though, because as you have said before, as we have talked about, no bill is ever dead. That goes to the ChickFilA bill. Did I see correctly that a medical marijuana bill may head to the Senate?
Medical marijuana is on track to perhaps become law, or at least an expanded version of the CBD oil law that was passed here in the last few years in Texas. The very limited program that we have right now only allows for folks who have what's called intractable epilepsy to be able to use this cannabis oil. But there is a move to try to expand that to people who have some other ailments as well. It's interesting that when it comes to the quote-unquote decriminalization of pot, which, as we talked about, the Texas House did not really pass that. They passed just sort of lessening the penalties for something that would still be criminal for having small amounts of pot. That's not going anywhere in the Texas Senate. But you do have this medical marijuana push that does have the support of the top political consultant for the lieutenant governor, a guy named Alan Blakemore from Houston, who's lobbying on that issue. So it's an interesting group of supporters there. I think that helps give it some legs, and you also have Republicans just taking an overall different view of all this. But change on this stuff is slow, but I can tell you, and I know you were at the Republican convention, I would assume you were at the deal in San Antonio last year. A lot of the delegates there are for, moving in that direction, right?
Yes.
I mean, they say that it's stupid to be punishing people just because we're mad at them. We should only really be punishing folks who, have done something to hurt others or are a threat to others. So it may not get done this legislative session, but I think we're one step closer.
Interesting. Scott Braddock, tell folks what they can find at Quorum Report today.
Well, we'll keep an eye on what's happening with the Senate Bill 9. I do think that, no matter what your opinion is on this piece of legislation, it's going to end up being very important to both Democrats and Republicans, with the Republicans saying that, they want to ensure voter integrity, especially heading into what will be a key election next year, a big presidential election in 20. The Democrats saying this is a disenfranchisement bill, and we're keeping everybody up to date on what's happening with that. You can get our free emails there at quorumreport.com. Sign up for free, but if you want to read the stories, that's where we get you.
Yeah,
that's where you got to pay. But the offer for the listeners is sign up right now. Choose Bill Me at checkout, and we'll give you a free month there at quorumreport.com.
Very nice, Scott. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.
That's Scott Braddock, editor of Quorum Report. Follow him on Twitter at Scott Braddock. Chad Hasty Show, KFYO.